John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he sleeps, his life was lost while struggling for the slave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory,
Welcome to War of the Rebellion, Stories of the Civil War. I am your host, Leon, and this is a reading of the history of the 72nd Indiana Volunteer Infantry of the Mounted Lightning Brigade. Written and compiled by B.F. McGee, we are moving on to Chapter 19. March 17th to June 24th, 1863. To horse, mounting, and incidents. Scouting for horses, mules, Negroes, and etc. 2 72nd men captured and cruelly shot. First fight and flight after mounted. Capture and escape of Dick McCann. Filth and sickness. Scouting improves health. Sibley tents exchanged for shelter tents. Various scouts. The Lightning Brigade draws its lightning guns, the Spencer rifles. Description of the Spencer rifles. Bold reconnaissance. Scouts to Readyville, Woodbury, and Liberty. Last scout north, east of Murfreesboro. That section utterly impoverished. Wilder's report of operations of the brigade. Ordered for the forward movement of the whole army. Chaplain Eddy's first sermon. Riding home before the battle. Reflections. On or about the 17th of March, the 72nd voted for and against mounting, and decided in favor of it. The 17th Indiana had already voted for mounting and had drawn part of their horses. We proposed to cease peeling the bottoms of our feet on Tennessee and Kentucky rocks and ride from this time forward. The 75th Indiana voted not to mount and was put into Hall's brigade, and the 123rd Illinois of that brigade voted to mount and took the place of the 75th Indiana. The brigade, after this most important epoch of mounting, was composed of the 17th and 72nd Indiana, 98th and 123rd Illinois regiments, and Nicklen's 18th Indiana Battery. These 4 regiments remained in the same brigade to the close of the war, and were as solid in attachment and action as brothers. After deciding to mount, the next thing was to get horses to mount. 1 or 2 companies were mounted on convalescent horses, a feeble sort of animal, which they drew on the 18th of March. For a few days we were occupied in details necessary to the great change which had taken place in our military mode of locomotion. We drew cavalry uniforms, but cut off the yellow stripe from the legs of the pants and jackets, so that we might not be taken for regular cavalry. We were a new branch of the service, simply mounted infantry. On the 26th, our division was reviewed by General Reynolds, and made a very imposing appearance. And on the 31st of March, the whole corps was reviewed by General Rosecrans. By the 1st of April, the brigade was all mounted, except for companies H, I, and K, and that day it started on another raid, backed by the rest of the 14th Division, which was joined in the vicinity of Carthage, Tennessee, by Stokes Tennessee Cavalry. Companies H, I, and K of our regiment, who were not yet mounted, were commanded on this expedition by Captain Hanna. We kept that night on the banks of Stone River. On the 2nd of April, we arrived at Lebanon, county seat of Wilson County, Tennessee, and found the mounted portion of our brigade there. Captain Hanna took command of the 3 dismounted companies as a provost guard and made his headquarters in the courthouse. Near Lebanon, the mounted men captured a lot of rebel prisoners, which they turned over to Captain Hanna at this place. On the 3rd, about 4 p.m., an alarm was sounded and we got rapidly into line of battle. Captain Hanna was one of those men who could not see fighting going on without taking part in it. On seeing the brigade rallying for a fight, he mustered his provost guard, prisoners and all, and marched out to the front to participate. To the great relief of the prisoners, he was ordered back to his provost duties. "Oh, damn it," said he. "I thought when there was fighting going on a fellow had a right to take part in it." There was no fight. On this same day, a detachment was in the vicinity of Taylorsville, Tennessee, assisting to destroy a lot of commissary stores, wheat, bacon, and etc. Captain Heron, Company B, was on picket duty with part of his company. He threw out Alma P. Wright, William P. Montgomery, and John W. Vance as vedettes. A superior force of rebels made a dash at them with the object of cutting them off. They were on a by-road leading off at an angle of about 20 degrees from the main road, and the rebels came down the main road, horses in a full run. Vance and Montgomery were cut off, but Wright, being in advance, urged his horse to utmost speed, hoping to reach our picket at the forks of the road before the rebels should cut him off from the post. The Johnnies rode after him furiously, pressing him hard and hallooing, "Halt! Halt, you damn Yank!" But Wright halted not, and only struck the rowels deeper into the flanks of his horse, which was flying before the foe, when the poor animal ran its head against a tree and fell dead. Wright shot through the air like an arrow some 20 feet, lit on his feet, never halted nor looked back, jumped a fence, ran with all speed and saved himself. The exploit was hailed with applause and laughter by his comrades, who were galloping to his relief, and the rebels were compelled to turn and fly to save themselves. But what of Vance and Montgomery? Let Vance himself tell the bloody story, and then let the reader say whether, in any civilized country, its wanton cruelty has been surpassed. Their comrades made a long and anxious search for the captured men that night, and the next day, but in vain, and supposed they were taken to southern prisons. After returning to camp at Murfreesboro, the facts which follow were ascertained from Vance himself. They were taken to Lebanon at night, and the next morning were ordered to be taken out and shot. They were led out of the town by men who tied them to a tree, and heeded not their manly protests that they were prisoners of war, and should not be murdered in that cruel manner. They were only answered that they were damned Yankee dogs, and ought to be hanged. Finding protests vain, they met their fate with brave resolution, commending their spirits to God. When the ruffians had tied them hand and foot to a tree, 2 rebels stepped close to them, and each rebel fired 3 shots into their heads. When they were untied, both fell forward on to their faces, but their fiendish foes, not being content, came up to their victims, placed their revolvers to the backs of their heads, and sent another ball through each, and then left them for dead. The first 3 balls had pierced the head of Vance, and the 4th shot entered above the left ear and came out at the left eye, tearing the eyeball out of the socket. When Vance fell from the tree on his face, he was still conscious, and had so much presence of mind that he tried to control his muscles and lie as still as if dead. He heard the murderers talk, and heard them determined to give both himself and Montgomery another round. Then the revolver was pressed to the back of his head, and he expected to pass into eternity. He heard the pistol almost in his ear, felt the ball crush through his head and tear out the left eyeball, and throw the dirt in his face. And yet, to his astonishment, he retained consciousness. But it was as in a troubled dream of terrible pain. He still lay perfectly quiet. The bloody devils who had perpetrated this heartless work muttered curses upon the bodies and souls of their victims, and mounting their horses dashed away, leaving the bodies to rot and be eat by buzzards and hogs, as they expressed it. As soon as Vance was sure they were gone, he attempted to raise his head, which was honeycombed by bullet holes and clotted with blood. After much effort, he succeeded in cleaning the mud and blood from his face so he could look about him. He saw no one near, and heard no sounds. The first effort of the noble soldier was to ascertain whether his comrade Montgomery was alive or dead. He crawled to the body, examined it, and found, alas, that life was extinct. Not being able to do anything for his comrade, he affectionately pressed his feeble hand upon the head of the noble dead, and began to crawl away, bleeding profusely, to a place of concealment near the road on which he had left his comrades, the pickets, the night before. He expected every moment to die from loss of blood. After lying by the road for some time, he saw a white man on a load of wood, and lay down till he passed by. For almost every white citizen was an enemy. After a while, a Negro came along, and as every Negro was the Union soldier's friend, Vance succeeded in attracting his attention. The wounded soldier was not mistaken. The old Negro compassionately and tenderly helped him to the Murfreesboro pike, and there he was taken up the same day by the Union cavalry, carried to Murfreesboro and cared for, notwithstanding his terrible wounds. And that all thought he would die. He got well, almost miraculous, and 12 years afterwards he served 2 terms as recorder of Tippecanoe County, Indiana. Remember, kind reader, that this was but one of hundreds of similar atrocities committed by the heartless creatures known as bushwhackers, who were really rebel robbers and murderers, but they were countenanced and encouraged by the regular rebel troops and the rebel civil authorities. Remember, too, that this act of kindness by that truly good Samaritan, the old Negro, who helped Vance to our lines at the peril of his life, is but one of thousands of such deeds of kindness, which will shine as the stars forever, and which prove the manly grandeur and tenderness of the African race. Thanks to God that the North gave such a people freedom. Major Adam Pinkerton says, "This almost incredibly cruel affair gave us of the 72nd to understand with what fiends we had to contend. Prisoners taken by us in open fight were treated as kindly as if they were brothers, but after that barbarous atrocity, bushwhackers were turned over to Company B, the company to which Vance and Montgomery belonged, and the provost marshal's list was never cumbered with their names." One can very understand, after the above relation, why the members of the 72nd dreaded being captured. We were a terror to the natives and as widely known as the command of Morgan. It was our business to scout for supplies, not only for ourselves but other commands, and also to destroy supplies when we could not take them. Hence we were dreaded and hated, and liable to cruel treatment if captured by rebel home guards. But they got very few of us, while we got many of them. On the night of the 3rd, our regiment camped on the farm of the rebel General Anderson, and got enough horses in the neighborhood to mount 1 company, and also took away 7 Negroes. The next morning we moved to Rome, Tennessee. On this march, large amounts of tobacco, forage, horses, mules, and slaves were captured. On the 7th, we proceeded towards Liberty. The mounted force proper were going by a route east of us, which would strike a road leading from Liberty to Smithville, on which they would approach Liberty opposite to the road we were on. A brigade of infantry and the 72nd constituted the force advancing from Alexandria. As we neared Liberty, the advance was opposed by rebel cavalry. The officer in command thought the proper thing to do would be to send cavalry after cavalry, so he ordered us front, and such another performance as was then enacted never occurred again during the war. We were ordered to move quick, but equipped as most of us were, a strap tied around the jaw of our steed and no saddle made it mighty uncertain whether we should go when we started. We were almost a match for the Bear Wallow Mule Brigade. Nevertheless, we all lit out at a sweeping gallop, and with a grim determination some of our horses going sideways and some behindwise. This terrific charge was sufficient to scare the enemy into falling back on liberty, where they made a stand. But as soon as we came up, we dismounted, formed on foot, moved into town, and found the enemy also formed on the opposite side of Dry Creek. We opened fire by volleys. On the second round, they broke and ran away on the road toward Smithville. Meeting our mounted force previously mentioned as coming on that road, got into a trap, and a company of 50 men and 2 commissioned officers were taken. Just here, an affair occurred which might have counterbalanced our success. The officer sending us ahead failed to inform us that another Union force would enter the town opposite to where we entered it. And before we began to retire on the column, which was now moving towards Murfreesboro, we saw a column of troops approaching upon the Smithville Road, upon which the enemy had just retreated. We naturally supposed the rebels had been reinforced and were bearing down upon us to make a vigorous attack. The dust they raised veiled them from sight, and imagination did the rest. We opened fire on them, but they neither halted nor changed formation, but advanced steadily in columns of 4. We began to fall back, but on they came. Once more we fired, and still on they came. Only a little faster, at least we thought so. The order was given, "Boys, to horse and get out of this." The scene which ensued beggars description. Our saddles have no stirrups, so we could not mount encumbered as we were with arms and ammunition. The efforts we made were truly ridiculous failures. Jumping upon our horses, our beasts would rest almost on their backs, and down we would go, flat upon the ground. All this time that awful column was advancing like an avalanche. We could stand the pressure no longer, for our fear was as intense as that of Ichabod Crane, as the headless Hessian bore down upon him in the darkness of the night. The clatter of the hoofs of the horses and the clash of the swords of the advancing column were in our ears. We abandoned our horses and skedaddled, men and horses mixed and mingled, and it is averred that no man let a horse get ahead of him. Everything that we could throw away except arms was abandoned in the flight. Soon as we came to a gorge in the hills called a gap, and here formed and determined we would hold the gap, we sent back to the main column for reinforcements. Just then a flag of truce was displayed at the head of the advancing column. A parley ensued, and the fact that our own supposed enemies were friends was discovered. We learned from them that they had captured part of the rebels we had driven out of town. Of course, we proceeded to get together our stock and stuff, like a joint snake that had been knocked to pieces with a club, with a sense of meekness over which had happened, and a conviction that some means of more certainly and speedily mounting, when pressed, was an absolute necessity. On this same day, Company A captured 10 rebels who said that Morgan had sent them to examine our picket posts, get the position of pickets, and report to him. They saw the posts, but failed to report. On the 8th, the brigade returned to Murfreesboro. The result of the trip was 196 horses, 110 prisoners, 35 slaves, and a large lot of forage. On the 9th, Companies H, I, and K drew saddles and cavalry equipments, and the regiment was now fully mounted. And we may remark, what no doubt the little affair of confusion at Liberty has suggested, that while we were well drilled as infantry, on our undrilled horses, we were a little less than a mounted mob for a little while. But we soon gave our horses a saddle, bridle, and spur drill, which led them to understand pretty well what we were up to. On the 11th, we were called up at 2 a.m., and moved at 4 a.m. we went towards Lebanon, and I then returned towards Laverne, crossing Stones River at Buchanan's Mill, and taking a bypath, we came suddenly upon some rebel cavalry, emptied some guns at them, captured 2, but the others scattered into the dense cedar thicket. We camped 6 miles from Laverne. On the 12th, we moved via Laverne and Nolensville to Franklin, Tennessee, and on the 13th, returned to Murfreesboro again. At this time, our assistant surgeon, Dr. William C. Cole, as brave and noble a man, and as good a surgeon as ever in the service, who had been detailed at Castilian Springs by General Dumont, December 13, 1862, for duty at the Gallatin Hospital, returned to the regiment. On his way from Gallatin to Nashville, he came near being gobbled by John Morgan. As Dr. Cole was so well known and highly esteemed in his regiment, and indeed in the brigade and division, we deem it proper to give him a fuller introduction here. In the course of the history, you will often meet him, always in the line of his duty at his post, always kind, always brave, always skillful. William Carnahan Cole, M.D., was born July 16, 1828, in Washington, Daviess County, Indiana, of English and Scotch-Irish ancestry. In his 18th year, enlisted in New Orleans, Louisiana, in the Regiment of Mounted Rifles, Smith's Brigade, Twiggs Division, and with that command under General Scott, participated in all the battles in the Valley of Mexico, entering the city September 14, 1847, and remaining until the close of the war. Discharged at Jefferson Barracks, Missouri, graduated in medicine from the Medical College of Ohio in August 1862. He assisted in recruiting Company H, 72nd Indiana, and was elected first lieutenant. On the arrival of the regiment at Indianapolis, Dr. Cole was commissioned by Governor Morton assistant surgeon, and after a little over 1 year's service in the field and in charge of Hospital No. 5, Gallatin, Tennessee, he was commissioned surgeon of the regiment, serving during the last year of the war as surgeon-in-chief of Wilder's Brigade of Mounted Infantry, and at the close of the last campaign, while at Macon, Georgia, he was detailed with Dr. Groves of the 98th Illinois to accompany the 4th Michigan in pursuit of Jeff Davis. Dr. Groves was present at the capture of that noted individual. He was mustered out at Indianapolis. The doctor is a member of the American Medical Association, Indiana State Medical Society, and Fountain County Medical Society, of which last he is an ex-president. He is also a member of the National and State Associations of Mexican Veterans. The doctor is a man of splendid physique, with a lofty but not ostentatious bearing. His mind is large and well-cultured. In his profession, as in his citizenship and among his comrades, he stands very high and above reproach. His views are comprehensive and liberal, his heart large and warm. All who know him love and admire him. He was always with us, and of all the officers of the regiment, he kept the only complete diary. It is very full. As we have never had access to morning reports of companies, we are under obligations to Dr. Cole for most of the information in regard to the sick and wounded, and feel sure that it is accurate. From April 14th to 20th, the regiment was constantly on picket and fatigue duty. On the morning of the 20th, the Wilder Brigade had a large force of infantry, accompanied by cavalry, moved east of Murfreesboro to Readyville. On the morning of the 21st, we were in Woodbury by sunup. The regiment took a by-road and was in the rear of McMinnville shortly after noon, but found the place already in possession of Union troops. The balance of the command having moved directly on the place. We quote from Comrade John Davis, Company D. On that afternoon, our force had a lively chase after Morgan, capturing Morgan's wife and the notorious Major Dick McCann of Morgan's staff, a wagon train loaded with bacon, 130 prisoners, a train of cars loaded with fat hogs, 300 woolen blankets, 30,000 pounds of bacon, 2 hogsheads of sugar, 3 hogsheads of rice, and 8 barrels of whiskey. We also burned a large grist mill, a train of cars, a railroad bridge, a cotton factory, and 2 bales of cotton. Sergeant Stewart, Company A, says, quote, "The next morning, McCann was missing, and when the guards were asked what had become of him, one of them sang out, 'Oh, he went up the rope and came down a slope into the happy land of Canaan,'" unquote. But the truth is, McCann's guards had got their canteens full of Applejack during the day, and when they were put on guard, they were afraid the officers would take the tangle foot away from them. McCann, being aware of their fears, sympathized with them, and proposed that they give their canteens to him, and they did so. During the night, the sly rebel gave the guards liquor as often as they wanted it, and each time pretended to drink with them. Before morning, the guards were so drunk that they could not tell McCann from a $2 dog, and the rebel slipped out and got away. That is the history given of McCann's escape in Basil M. Duke's History of Morgan's Cavalry. The 72nd had nothing to do with McCann at that time. Minty's brigade captured him, and the 4th Regulars guarded him. Sergeant Record says that at Peachtree Creek, he fell in with one of the men who guarded McCann, and he admitted that they were so drunk on the night he escaped that they didn't know they ever had him. The only connection the 72nd had with the McCann affair was that we passed the place where the rebels had been whipped a few minutes before, and Will Harvey, Company I, got McCann's hat, and it never got away. On April 22nd, we moved to Smithfield. No fires were allowed, consequently, no supper. On the 23rd, we moved so early that we took no breakfast, marching via Snow Hill. We reached Liberty, where we fed the horses and took dinner. At this place we destroyed a large flouring mill. While Company D was getting corn out of a large bin, they found some nice hams. This led to further search, and 2 rebels were found under the floor. We camped that night near Alexandria, and here again the enterprising John Davis and Jimmy Hall of Company D succeeded in getting more hams. And as they were running off with them, the landlady exclaimed, "There! The villains are carrying off my meat!" On the 24th, we stayed near Alexandria and scouted 8 miles east, capturing a rebel team and wagon, and also some horses, mules, and some stragglers from the enemy. On the 25th, the command moved to within 8 miles of Lebanon, scouting parties scattering all over the country, bringing in cattle, horses, mules, slaves, and rebel prisoners. On the 26th, we moved on to Lebanon, scouring the country. As yesterday, with liberal success, Company I got 9 rebels. We again quote from Comrade John Davis of D. Here a detail was made to hunt the body of Montgomery, who was captured and shot by the rebels on the 3rd of April. The particulars of which have been given. While Vance and Montgomery were being led through Lebanon, a certain tavern keeper shouted out, quote, "Hang the damned sons of bitches! I'll find the rope." Unquote. The detail did not find the body, but proposed to hang the tavern keeper to make him tell where it was, and it is presumed they did their duty. 27th. The same duty as yesterday with varied success. A heavy rainstorm and picket firing at night. 28th. The 72nd started for Murfreesboro with all the captured stuff. Horses, mules, Negroes, rebels, etc. Arriving in the evening. But the brigade did not get in until the next day. This was a long and successful scout during which the men were in the highest spirits and best of humor. We quote from Dr. Cole's journal of April 15th. Quote, "Sickness in the regiment prevails to an alarming extent. Average attendance at the sick call, 100, and perhaps 100 more are not fit for duty. This army of 40,000 men is encamped on a space so small that it is utterly impossible to keep the camps clean. Thousands of dead horses, mules, and offal of every description literally cover the whole face of the earth inside our picket lines, and each emits 1,000 stinks, and each stink different from its fellow. The weather for months has been almost one continual flood of rain. And now, as the sun comes up more nearly straight over us and pours down his boiling rays on this vast, sweltering mass of putridity, the stinks are magnified, multiplied, and etherealized until the man is the moon must hold his nose as he passes over this vast sea of filth." Unquote. On the 29th of April, Dr. Cole says just after the scout above mentioned, the health of the regiment has rapidly improved on the scout, owing to a change of air, and from salt army rations to fresh diet. On May 1st, we turned over our Sibley tents and drew French shelter tents called by the men dog tents, on account of their smallness and lowness. These were stout sheets of duck canvas, 6 feet square, and so arranged, with buttons and buttonholes along the edges, that any number of pieces could be buttoned together, either forming long strips or large square sheets. Perhaps these tents, as much as any other mechanical convenience, began immediately to contribute to the health of the army. We quote from Sergeant Records, May 1st. The stench of this great encampment is becoming utterly unendurable, and these scouts are hailed with delight. The health of the regiment is rapidly improving, and the morale and discipline of the brigade are in a high state of perfection. On the 2nd, we moved our camp 2 miles northeast of Murfreesboro, near the picket lines, and close to the boiling springs. We were delighted when the wind came from the northeast. We could then get a breath of fresh air. On May 6th, we moved to Luverne through a heavy rain, and remained there until the morning of the 9th, when we moved on by roads in a northeast course, passing through Silver Springs and camped on the Lebanon Road, about 10 a.m. The column was fired upon, and Company D was detached to give the rebels chase, which was an exciting one, resulting in the capture of a few prisoners. In the evening of this day, Madison Barton, Company E, accidentally shot himself in the knee, and his leg was taken off by Dr. Cole. The accident to this faithful soldier and his loss to the regiment were deeply regretted. On the 10th, Company I went across the river, northwest as a guard for a supply train, and took Barton, the wounded man, with them. He got well. In the afternoon, the command went to Lebanon, and on the 11th returned to Murfreesboro. We were now well mounted, and our rapid movements soon gave us such notoriety that we were called the Lightning Brigade. It was part of the original plan that when mounted we should be armed with repeating rifles. Accordingly, on the 15th of May, we turned over our old companions, the Springfield rifles, and drew the famous Spencer repeating rifles. These rifles were of so much importance in our subsequent movements, and were so conspicuous in making the brigade distinctive and successful in the service, that we here give a description of the Spencer and compare it with some other repeating rifles. Up to the breaking out of the rebellion, all the armies of the world, so far as we know, were armed with a muzzle-loading, single-shooting gun. The percussion cap was a great improvement over the flint, yet a gun using the flint could be loaded as quickly, fired as rapidly, would shoot as far and as accurately as a gun using the percussion cap. Citizens of the United States were not a fighting people. Hence her inventive genius had never been pressed to produce anything better than the common sporting rifle, used in hunting game. There had been some improvement in projectiles, the mini-ball, with a hollow, expansive base that would catch and hold all the force of the powder, was a vast improvement over the round ball, that permitted 1/3 of the force of the powder to spread around the ball, and even to get past it before leaving the muzzle. But as before stated, when our war broke out, our soldiers were armed with the same muzzle-loading gun with which our forefathers fought in the battles of the Revolution. With these guns, it was impossible for the most experienced soldier to load and fire more than twice per minute. This, for a fast people like the Americans, was entirely too slow. And acting upon the principle laid down by Sherman in his memoirs, that the more destructive you can make war, the more humane it is, genius began to invent guns that could be more rapidly loaded and fired. A gun was greatly needed that would shoot accurately at long range, that could be fired a number of times without stopping to load, and that would not get out of repair. To invent such a gun, many unsuccessful attempts were made. Among the first of these attempts was Colt's repeating rifle, which was made with a barrel of the usual length of army rifles. Instead of loading at the muzzle, it had a revolving cylinder at the breech containing 5 chambers, into which as many loads could be placed, but it took quite as long to load one of these chambers as it did to put in a single load from the muzzle, so that there was no time gained in loading. But after the chambers were all loaded, they could be fired very rapidly. But as there was a possibility of 2 or more chambers being discharged at once, thus crippling about as many of those using them as the enemy, few regiments were ever armed with them. They were very heavy and clumsy to handle, and were soon abandoned. The next candidate for favor was the Henry rifle. This was a vast improvement over the Colt. It was short in the barrel and light in the breech. On the underside of the barrel was a chamber into which could be placed 16 metallic cartridges. In order to get these cartridges into the barrel of the gun, a light lever, which was also a guard for the trigger, was thrown forward. This threw the breech pin, we call it that for the want of a better name, back far enough to admit one cartridge to pass up opposite the hole in the barrel, and as the lever was pulled back, it was pushed in ready for firing. The usual motion of hammer and trigger completed the work. Every time the lever was moved, it also threw out the metallic shell that had contained the powder. This gun could be loaded and fired 16 times in a minute, but easily got out of repair, and was, from its shape, entirely unfit for the manual of arms. Aside from scouts and sharpshooters, it was never used by the Army. Next came the Spencer rifle. This, to our mind, was so nearly perfect that after using it for 2 years, our brigade had not a single change to suggest, and after a lapse of 20 years, we have seen nothing equal to it. The barrel of the Spencer rifle was 2 feet 8 inches long, cased on the underside with a light strip of walnut, held in place by 3 rings or thimbles. This barrel screwed into a heavy piece of iron, which had a slot or mortise in from top to bottom. In this mortise was the breech pin, worked up and down by a lever much the same as the Henry rifle. The stock was walnut, much the size and shape of the Springfield or Enfield rifles in common use in the Army. In the center of this stock was a cylinder, or barrel, which also screwed into the heavy piece of iron at the other end. This barrel would hold 7 metallic cartridges. These cartridges were pushed up and held in place by a spiral spring. The hammer and trigger worked just like any other gun. To load after the chambers were filled up, all you had to do was to throw the lever or trigger guard forward, which would throw out on top the empty cartridge shell from which the ball had been fired. And as you drew the lever back to its place, another cartridge slipped into the barrel, ready to fire. This gun could be loaded and fired 7 times in a minute. It never got out of repair. It was put together entirely with screws, and anybody that had sense enough to be a soldier could take one all to pieces and put it all together, just as well as the man that made it. The gun shot a forced ball. That is, the bore in the barrel was smaller at the muzzle than at the breech. It would shoot a mile just as accurately as the finest rifle in the world. When held in the hands at a ready, the weight was exactly balanced between the 2 hands. It was the easiest gun to handle in the manual of arms drill we have ever seen. It could be taken all to pieces to clean, and hence was little trouble to keep in order. Quite an item to lazy soldiers. We are safe in saying that another great war will never be fought by the United States with muzzle-loading guns. The Spencer rifle demonstrated the superiority of breech-loading repeaters. This, or an improved repeater, will be the rifle of future wars in the United States, and perhaps in Europe. About this time, the regiment began a system of instruction in the management of their horses, in evolutions in squad, company, and battalion drill, and of movements in line and skirmish drill, which perhaps had never been attempted by Federal troops before. It is safe to say that in this drill, we had learned many valuable lessons from the rebel John H. Morgan, for this was actually his system of drill which we adopted. This system was afterwards modified and simplified a little, and adopted by all the cavalry service and the Army of the Cumberland, and is the basis of General Upton's tactics now used by the United States Army, both infantry and cavalry. We were not cavalry, but simply mounted infantry. A new branch of the service, which of course required new methods. Also about this time, there was organized a corps of scouts in each regiment of the brigade. By taking one picked man from each company, all the scouts of any one regiment were under command of one sergeant and one corporal. Afterwards, all the scouts of the brigade were placed under the command of a commissioned officer. On May 21st, we turned over all extra baggage and had orders to move at a moment's notice, and Colonel Miller says that the whole army had the same orders. Our picket lines had been frequently attacked during the last few days. On the 22nd, our brigade and 2 guns of the 18th Indiana Battery made a reconnaissance in force of the enemy's front, and the left moved out southeast on the Manchester Road. When near Hoover's Gap, the rebel vedettes were driven in. The picket post was charged and some prisoners taken from 2 Georgia cavalry regiments. Company C was left here to menace the rebel camp, which was in plain view, and the column turned east. At every road leading toward the enemy, the vedettes and pickets were driven in and a company left to watch them. In the afternoon, the head of the column reached out McMinnville Road, where the command concentrated and moved back to camp, having reconnoitered 1/3 of the rebel front, causing great consternation in the whole rebel army. We had killed a few, captured a few, and driven off the rest. Colonel Miller said we returned to camp in fine style, which remark had a most exhilarating influence on the regiment. We were agreeably surprised to see what damage we could inflict on the enemy, and retire from our exasperated foe without being punished. On May 24th, we moved east to Readyville, and on the 25th made a march of 30 miles, captured a few prisoners, and returned to camp on the 22nd. On the 25th, Private William Swift, Company C, had half his head shaved, and was drummed in front of the division, and sent to the penitentiary to work out the balance of his term of service for deserting his post while on picket. On June 1st, Companies E and B, under command of Captain Kilbourne, went to Readyville, and at midnight started to Woodbury to surprise a camp of rebels. While on their way, a most terrific rain and thunderstorm came upon them, which those on the expedition will never forget. When they reached Woodbury, the rebels were gone. On June 4th, we moved early, taking the road to Liberty, regimental scouts in advance. We captured the rebel pickets at Auburn without making any alarm, and the column moved into Liberty. 2 miles out, the only rebel vedette on the road was shot and killed, leaving the rebel camp to our mercy. The brigade moved swiftly in a column of 4s, the 72nd in advance, Colonel Miller at its head. The scouts are thrown forward, right and left as flankers, and rush into Liberty full sweep. The rebels are taken completely by surprise. Their horses are unsaddled. They are quietly getting supper, and our sudden appearance causes a wild stampede. Our scouts did most of the firing. The brigade halted, but the 72nd pursued. The rebels attempted to rally in Liberty, but they were so closely pressed that they broke and fled to the opposite side of Dry Creek and began forming. With Colonel Miller at our head and never changing formation, we rushed down upon them in a steady gallop. This sort of tactics was new to them, and without waiting to fire a second shot, they broke and fled from the field. We pursued them some distance and captured 20 of them. At sundown, we abandoned the pursuit, returned to the brigade, and went into camp, having marched 30 miles that day. The rebels left an immense amount of stuff in their camp, and strewn along after them in wild confusion. On the 5th, the 72nd lay in camp, and the 98th Illinois went to Dark Bend on the Cumberland River. The 123rd Illinois took after the rebels, that we ran out of camp last evening, had a fight with the enemy, and drove them beyond Snow Hill to Smithsville. On the 6th of June, we moved to Auburn, where Colonel Miller made his headquarters. A detail of 20 men from each company under Lieutenant Colonel S.G. Kirkpatrick were ordered to scout towards Woodbury. Deploying on each side of the road, they went to within 5 miles of Woodbury. The scout was lively and successful, resulting in the capture of a lot of stock. Company I broke a rebel soldier's thigh and captured 3 others. The expedition returned to camp that evening. While we were out, the Teamsters and camp guard had a lively adventure. A party of rebels dashed into camp and tried to capture the trains. The men rallied and drove them away, but they carried one of our men with them. Our men mounted and gave chase with such zeal that they rescued their comrade, wounded 3 rebels, and captured 3 others. When the rebels first charged on the camp, 2 burly furrow fellows dashed up to John Hamilton, Company I, regimental teamster, and ordered him to hitch up quick and drive out. "I won't do it," said John in his Irish brogue, "for this is Colonel Miller's wagon, and I'll be domed if yez shall have it." At the mention of Colonel Miller, of course, they wanted it all the more, and leveling their guns at John, they said, "Hitch up quick or we'll shoot you." "Shoot and be dummed with yez," said John as he dived under the wagon bed. 2 bullets crashed through the wagon bed as he popped up on the other side, but it was a clear miss. Swearing by all the saints, he yelled out, "You dommed buggers," seized his Spencer and brought it to a ready, and the rebels left very sudden, while John sent 2 or 3 shots after them. On June 7th, we returned to Murfreesboro with 60 prisoners, 320 horses and mules, and part of a captured wagon train. It would be impossible to name all the incidents connected with this scout, or the result of each company's work separately. All entered into the work with a zest, and each company was about equally successful. June 10th. At 6 this morning, a detail of an officer and 15 men from each company started under command of Lieutenant Colonel Kirk, as we always called him, for Lebanon, while the remainder of the brigade moved on to Liberty. 1 north and 1 northeast, about 30 miles from Murfreesboro. The brigade got near Liberty half an hour by sun, and the 72nd dashed into the place to find the enemy gone. Only 1 rebel was killed that day. The 72nd went back and camped with the brigade. According to Colonel Miller's notes, an attack from Morgan was expected that night. Lieutenant R.C. Clark, commanding scouts on this occasion, says, "We encountered the rebel pickets about 2 miles from Liberty, routed them and pursued them hotly, and were right upon them when we reached a point just before entering town, where the creek is on the right of the road and a very high precipitous cliff on the left with only a wagon road between. When we were fairly in this position, we were fired upon from the cliff, which was so steep, and the enemy being directly above us, overshot us. There were 200 on the cliff, commanded by a major. To stop or try to turn and retreat was certain death. So we dashed through and around the foot of the cliff and came out right amongst them. Our men deployed, and as our Spencer rifles were fully loaded, we did very good execution. The rebel major called out that he surrendered, but our men were too much deployed to hear what he said. To enable them to hear, we gave the command to cease firing, and the rebels mounted and retreated pell-mell, we after them. We ran them through town and about 2 miles into the country, taking several prisoners. The number of old rebel haversacks and amount of cornbread scattered by the flying foe along the road and through town was immense. If my men had ceased firing when the order was given, we could have marched the 200 men in as prisoners. We were called up before day, the 11th, saddled immediately and waited till noon, but no rebels came. In the afternoon we moved to Alexandria and camped overnight. On the next morning, the 12th, we went on to Lebanon, where we met the detachment under Colonel Kirkpatrick. They had been successful in collecting a very large lot of forage, horses, cattle, and Negroes. The Negroes had recently taken to gathering in the vicinity of roads, and when the Yankee troops would come along, would fall in and go with them. They had learned to take advantage of the Emancipation Proclamation. Some of these Negroes were taken into the service of the officers, and some employed to cook and groom horses for the messes, and made themselves very useful, taking many a burden off the soldiers. One man captured on this occasion, named Wyatt, or Wallach as we called him, stayed with Company F until we were mustered out, and then crossed the Ohio River with us at Jeffersonville. We returned to Murfreesboro on the 13th. This was the last scout of the 72nd north and east of that place, and Dr. Cole remarks that the country is in a most deplorable condition, there being neither horse, forage, nor provisions of any kind left in it. Duke's History of Morgan's Cavalry says the same thing. From the 1st of February, 1863, the brigade has been through the rebel lines 28 times, has taken 1,157 prisoners, 4,000 horses, and a small army of slaves. In the last expedition, we took 600 prisoners, 800 horses, and 250 slaves, killed 10 guerrillas, and mortally wounded Colonel Grant. We have hung 5 and shot 15 rebels, including a second lieutenant, caught with our uniform on. And it was the order of General Rosecrans to take the lives of all rebel soldiers found wearing a Union uniform. The above is from Colonel Wilder's report. In all this work, the 72nd had done its full share. On the 20th, we moved camp northwest of Murfreesboro, close to Stones River, and were busy until the morning of the 24th in active preparations to take part in the forward movement of the Grand Army of the Cumberland. On the 23rd, we were ordered to be ready to move next morning. At daylight, with 10 days' rations and 80 rounds of ammunition, everybody in camp knew what this meant. We had been 4 months waiting and expecting the army to move forward, and the order for 80 rounds of cartridges assured us that the time had come at last. Gentle reader, please imagine yourself in a position where you know that on the morrow you may enter into mortal combat with an enemy your equal, in which you know that the chances are that you, instead of he, may bite the dust. And suppose, too, that behind you are wife, children, father, mother, sister, brother, and sweetheart, whom you have not seen for months, and may never see again. How you would like to give them a glimpse into your inmost soul. How you would like to assure them of your love and constancy as you stand upon this border of Deathland. But you hesitate. You would not for one moment have them think that you even dream of such imminent danger, lest you give them anxiety and pain. Whatever the feelings may be, or however different in different individuals, such orders always brought out the materials for writing. And on this evening, under the pressure of marching orders, thousands of tender missives were written to beloved ones at home. To write a few lines to their beloved ones was one of the last duties performed by soldiers in the field before facing death. It seemed like speaking what might be our last words to them. And then we were braver, and could face death firmer. Often the order would come from our considerate commanders who themselves were like us, 1 half-hour for letter writing, and then in 2 minutes thousands of pens were in motion, not writing of the perils of the situation, but speaking words of love and all the encouragement possible. It was amazing what cheerful letters could be written in the very face of death. To our regiment, the circumstances were peculiarly impressive. Our chaplain had resigned and gone home, and for months we had not heard the gospel of peace. But on the 14th of this month a new chaplain had come to us, and this evening preached his first sermon. How fully he realized the necessity of preparation for tomorrow. With that earnestness, he presented to us the way of life. But we must not anticipate. Suffice it to say that when the last notes of the bugle that sounded tattoo died away in the hills, and when the last light was put out in the lonely tent, each soldier lay down to sleep, well understanding what was expected of him on the morrow, and as well understanding what might happen to him, but ready for duty at all hazards. In order that the movement about to be made may be more clearly understood, and the part taken by the 72nd made plainer, a few remarks as to the relative positions of the two great armies are necessary. When General Rosecrans drove Bragg out of Murfreesboro, January 1st, 1863, Bragg fell back to the south side of Duck River, almost due south from Murfreesboro, and made that river his line of defense, and his front, or line of battle, took the general direction of that stream, which at that place is almost due west. The headquarters of Bragg were at Shelbyville, 12 miles south of Murfreesboro. His right wing rested on Winchester, and his left extended towards Farmington. At the same time, General Rosecrans disposed his army as follows. The center, the 14th Corps commanded by Thomas, in and about Murfreesboro, McCook's 20th Corps as the right wing, to the southwest of Murfreesboro, and Crittenden's 21st Corps as the left wing to the northeast of Murfreesboro. The Army had a general front to the southeast or a little east of South. The pickets between the two armies on the road from Murfreesboro to Shelbyville were in sight of each other, while Morgan, during January and February, constantly scouted about our camp, often passing entirely around our army. The scouting in which we had taken part, up to this time, had been directed to breaking up Morgan's command and impoverishing the country, so that he could not subsist to the east and north of Murfreesboro. We had quite thoroughly done this, and now others' work is before us. Rosecrans opened the campaign by moving his right wing, McCook's 20th Corps, south, making a strong feint on Bragg's center at Shelbyville. The left wing, Crittenden's 21st Corps, moved straight east to Readyville, and thence southeast to McMinnville. The center, General Thomas's 14th Corps, moved southeast on the Manchester Pike. Reynolds' division belonged to Thomas's Corps, and Wilder's brigade to Reynolds' division. Our division moved first in the corps, our brigade in advance, and our regiment advance guard. This gives you the position, as nearly as possible, and shows you that we are directly in front. We now return to arouse the men we left sleeping in camp at Murfreesboro. But my friends, that is going to be for chapter 20 in the next episode. So let's hop into our show notes. We got a lot to talk about. So, the Mounted Lightning Brigade is mounted at last. And what a real showing that these 6 months of turning them into soldiers has really paid off. They are now an effective fighting force ready for war. Let's talk about the survival of Vance. Shot 4 times in the head and lived. Now, Vance and Montgomery both being shot like that is awful, and surviving it makes it probably one of the most insane stories I have ever heard. I'm not sure how his brain survived at all, but things are crazy like that. That's absolutely true. And I think something like this is very telling. And takes a lot of that lost cause propaganda and tosses it in the trash where it belongs, because these people clearly were not Americans. And that these Union soldiers in these memoirs and their histories are constantly talking about how the white people of the South cannot be trusted, are generally seen as like evildoers. But black Americans at every turn are heroes. At every turn, in every single one of these books that we have read, black Americans come to the rescue of the United States of America, and they did it without any recognition and at the expense of their own lives. I can't even put that into... We have almost no statues about this, and there's not a lot of work that I have been able to find that talks about black Americans doing this kind of heroism and it being recorded and put down into a book. Of some kind. I don't know. Maybe there's been a study or two that have done. I found a couple of books about Yankee soldiers escaping from prisons and what it was like. But, man, it's just... God bless the United States of America and the people who kept it together and the people who helped us do it. I'm telling you, man. This is just absolutely nuts. So this unnamed black man puts his life on the line to save Vance. And he will never saw a dime, no recognition, nothing, except for what is recorded here. As far as I'm concerned, we need something that's very similar to the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, but for black Americans who were enslaved who fought against the Confederacy. There might be some out there, but I want one. It's got to be 10 stories tall, because the amount of effort and work that they put in to overthrowing this terrorist government is just so important. So, and as B.F. McGee put it, quote, "is but one of thousands of such deeds of kindness which will shine as the stars forever, and which prove the manly grandeur and tenderness of the African race. Thanks to God that the North gave such a people freedom, unquote. Not only is that lovely and beautiful writing, it touches on exactly what is so important with this war. Now, I want to talk a little bit about bushwhackers being handed over to Company B. I find that as a fitting punishment for traitors, if I ever saw one. So the fact that every time they got bushwhackers, they were handed over to the guys who suffered from it the most is very... Man, that's war. If you don't want that to happen to you, don't start it. All right. Now, how they talk favorably about the Spencer repeating rifle is incredibly entertaining. It is mythical, almost. Of course, the other weapons he talks about, the Henry, obviously, a lot of these rifles, and the Colt, they just couldn't make it in the Union Army. You gotta be able to drag it through the mud. It's gotta be stupid proof. There's all of these things that we know today about firearms, about modern firearms that are clearly working their way through the Union Army and through kind of linear warfare. So it's very interesting to see how it begins to develop. I feel like they hit all of the right talking points in this, B.F. McGee does. Saying that these are the weapons of the future, he's entirely correct. A little late because we ended up switching to bolt-action rifles for the majority of infantrymen. But eventually, we skipped out of the bolt-action, and soldiers were able to have kind of more effective weapons. But very interesting. And to see them kind of come at the very end of this to be these real soldiers coming out on the other end. So with that, I'm keeping my notes real brief. This is just a real excellent episode. I feel like B.F. McGee does a great job of using his sources within the regiment to kind of describe what's going on. I hope you guys enjoy it. I hope you have a very Merry Christmas. This is your Christmas present. You're welcome. Been so busy with school, changing all sorts of things. Oh my gosh. So thank you all for listening, Mush Eaters. I will see you in the next episode. And this is only one part of your Christmas present. The other part is also coming out today. So by all means, enjoy it. And I will see you in the next episode. Mush Eaters. Bye-bye.
John Brown's body lies a-mouldering in the grave, while weep the sons of bondage whom he ventured all to save. But though he sleeps, his life was lost while struggling for the slave. His soul is marching on. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Glory, glory, hallelujah. Hallelujah, for his soul is marching on.